Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How should India respond to the Galwan killings and what impact will they have on India-China relations? Those are two key issues I should explore today with India's former ambassador to China and former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao. Mrs. Rao, let's start with the Galwan killings, which led to 20 Indian soldiers losing their lives. And now it's reported in many papers today that perhaps as many as 10 more soldiers, including an officer or two, are missing. In one instance, it's even assumed they could have been captured by the Chinese. In these circumstances, do you feel the government will feel a need to retaliate?
Well, Karan, thank you for having me on your show. As far as the Galwan Valley killings are concerned, this is definitely a turning point in India-China relations. As we have defined these relations over the last 30 to 32 years, since Rajiv Gandhi made his epic visit to China in December of 1988, the fact that the casualty figures from Galwan are so high, and as you say, they could go up even higher, and some of our men and officers are missing, raises the alarm even more and adds a further toxicity to the situation. Now, on the question of whether the government is going to retaliate, I am, of course, not privy to the inner workings of government. I've heard some of the BJP members and spokesmen speaking about the fact that this cannot go unanswered, although they leave it to the government to take whatever action is deemed fit. But the point is that we have to go into the reasons as to why the situation escalated to this level. What went so terribly wrong on Monday night so that now you see really a bad moon rising in the India-China relationship? The situation had kind of been bubbling over since early May, not only in the Galwan area, but you'd seen incursions across other points of the line of actual control, including Pangong Tso in the western sector of the line of actual control. But somehow in Galwan, things went out of hand, and the numbers of people, our men and officers who lost their lives, is really, really too much to contemplate.
I will definitely go into the reasons why this happened because, in a sense, that explains what China is doing. But first, let me ask you one more question about the need to retaliate. Unconfirmed reports suggest that the Chinese were exceptionally brutal in their treatment of Indian soldiers. There are accounts which suggest that soldiers were pushed off the cliff. Certainly, their bodies had to be salvaged from the Galwan River. In one instance, it's even suggested that this is how Colonel Babu lost his life. Given that Prime Minister Modi has this 56-inch strongman image, and given that he's very proud of the speed with which he responded to Pulwama when he carried out the Balakot strike, will he not be under pressure, both personal and political, to react similarly this time round? Otherwise, it will look as if his response has been weak, if not supine.
Well, Karan, I think Galwan cannot be equated with Balakot, and China is not Pakistan. I mean, facts are facts, and we have to embrace that reality. But yes, it is a direct message that the Chinese are sending to Prime Minister Modi personally. I mean, a kind of a taunt, I would say. They've thrown the gauntlet, as it were, and they're looking to see what our response will be. But I believe that a response need not just be that Pavlovian desire to retaliate, hit back, that they will have to pay for the lives lost. All that is very well, and that's the gut reaction, and one can quite understand that. But we have to take the long view. I mean, as was said by Prime Minister Nehru after the 1962 conflict, when the matter was being discussed with great anger and passion in government, in Parliament, he said, we cannot march to Peking. Now, is our intention to march to Peking, or Beijing as it's called now, or is it our intention to take a long view of this relationship with China, our neighbor? There's no need for appeasement. Engagement with China has definitely to be redefined in the months and years to come, because this is a watershed event. In many senses, I think the paradigm of relations that we had put in place after the Rajiv Gandhi visit was also thrown off the precipice in Galwan. So here we are, back to the drawing board. The situation along the line of actual control has to be managed in a way that we don't confront a scenario where it becomes increasingly difficult, given the asymmetry of power that we have with China. It becomes a challenge that kind of envelops us and prevents us from the internal balancing that we need within the country to handle all the issues that we face at this moment, especially during coronavirus pandemic.
Let's at this point then come to try and understand what China was doing and why, so that we can, on that basis, make some sense of where the relationship is heading. The bizarre part is all of this happened at a time when the two countries were supposedly disengaging. In fact, Colonel Babu and the soldiers who were attacked had actually gone to check on whether China had retreated as it said it would, only to be ambushed by some 250 or 300 Chinese soldiers. So the first question is, where does this leave the disengagement talks we're having? And doesn't it in fact suggest that when our army chief said, and I'm quoting his exact words, that China has done a lot of disengagement, that really wasn't true? Not that he was lying, but China was deceiving us. They had given us an indication they would disengage and did not.
Well, the Chinese have a behavioral trait which you can only define as sly mockery. I think that was the definition applied to their stance also during the 1960 officials talks when we discussed the boundary. So what you see is not what you get as far as the Chinese are concerned. So there's every reason for us not to read too much between the lines as far as the statements they make are concerned, so that they conform to the conclusions that we would like to make. But in this case, it's true that on the 6th of June, the corps commanders met, and a regime or a protocol for disengagement was ostensibly agreed to, and there had been subsequent meetings at the junior level also to take this forward. So what happened on Monday night? It's a little, there is a fog that surrounds it. There's a kind of a haze that surrounds the whole sequence of events. Our patrol goes there, sees some structures still in the area of disengagement, and they proceed. What did they proceed to do? And that's where the big, the haze gets even deeper. What really happened? We need to dissect this. I'm not talking of postmortems, but I'm talking of a need to dissect this under a microscope to see how we could have avoided this also.
In that spirit of dissecting under a microscope, let me raise one question about what in fact was happening. Newspaper reports both yesterday and today suggest that Colonel Babu went there at 7:30 in the evening. Now that is dark in the mountains, and this is dangerous terrain. Why did he go to check if the Chinese were retreating at 7:30 in the evening, particularly when he had no reason to doubt them? He was simply verifying that they were doing what they promised. Isn't it strange this should have happened at 7:30? Isn't that one of the questions that needs to be answered?
I think that is definitely a question that needs to be answered. Now, whether he went there on the basis of a decision he himself took as the battalion in charge, the battalion commander, or whether there were instructions from the higher levels of leadership within the army that he should go there and verify the situation. So, it was a kind of a trust but verify situation, I think. I don't know to what extent. We obviously did not trust the Chinese enough, which is why we went there to verify. But it beats me also why they should have gone there at 7:30 in the evening, at a time when, the terrain, when they knew that the terrain is difficult, and darkness complicates the situation further. So we really don't know why that decision was taken, but the consequences are there for all of us to see.
Something that's even more important about Galwan is that the Chinese paper Global Times, which is often thought of as a mouthpiece of the Chinese government, has quoted the PLA's Western Theatre Command spokesperson to say that the Galwan Valley is Chinese, and he insists it's always been Chinese. Now, the Indian position has been that the Galwan Valley is one area where there's no dispute over the LAC. And suddenly now, if the Chinese claim that it's always been theirs, isn't this a sign that their intent is deliberate expansion of territory? They're coming into Indian territory, claiming it as their own and pushing us back. That looks like the intent in Galwan.
I definitely think that is the intent in Galwan, and the Chinese are pushing their so-called claim into an area that had not seen any such upheaval for the last 4 to 5 decades. I mean, there obviously been at some point minor transgressions here and there, but nothing of this sort. And this is very much a part of Chinese behavior today. If you look at their behavior patterns across the region, look at what they do in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, what they've done with the artificial islands, what they do in terms of buzzing ships and kind of going after fishermen. They are, engaged in a very aggressive push forward, and you saw that in Ladakh also.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that what we've seen in terms of Chinese assertiveness, aggressiveness, is part of a pattern that we're seeing in Chinese behavior in other parts of the world as well. But let me stick for a moment to examples of China's intent to expand into Indian territory. The same can be discerned from what happened in Pangong Lake, where the Chinese have erected defensive structures that deny India access to patrolling in 50 square kilometers where previously we were patrolling. And Ajay Shukla, who's very well informed, now says that in fact, since the Galwan incident, the Chinese have also intruded into Indian territory in Depsang. So once again, what's happening in Pangong, what seems to be happening in Depsang suggests once again that the Chinese are deliberately intruding into Indian territory and pushing the LOC, as far as we are concerned, backwards, but forwards for themselves.
Yeah, it's very ironic that they accuse us of disturbing the status quo. If you look at, the statements that they've made, when they are doing that themselves. I mean, really the finger should point at them. And this is, I think, although the line of actual control has been relatively quiet in the last few decades, and we've never seen any loss of life or exchange of fire, if you look at what happened in the early years of the conflict, after the discovery of the Aksai-Chin highway, which they constructed through the Aksai-Chin in the mid-50s, the Chinese line advanced westward and westward and westward. It was like a moving finger, writing and writing, moving on. Chou Lai talked about a 1956 claim line, which when we had the talks in 1960, we found that they had advanced in their claim far ahead of that. So this is a line that keeps moving, and it started moving again. We don't know what the Chinese end game is on this.
Absolutely, but at the moment, as we look at the situation, whether you view it from the Galwan end or the Pangong Lake end or even the new Depsang end, doesn't it seem that this amounts to a massive escalation by China, deliberately intended to fundamentally change the status quo on the line of actual control, occupy Indian territory, and push us back?
Absolutely, it is. They are attempting to change the status quo, and the whole question of how we settle these issues with China. We had established a certain protocol. We put in place mechanisms to maintain peace and tranquility. We had the special representatives talks between the two sides in order to attempt to see how we could arrive at a border settlement. All that has been kind of thrown into a state of disarray, and in many senses a death knell sounded to all those protocols and mechanisms for establishment of peace and tranquility along in the border areas. So in a sense, where do the two sides go from now? But I think in our foreign ministry statement yesterday, in the concluding paragraph after Foreign Minister Jaishankar spoke to Chinese Minister Wang Yi, it was said that, both sides agreed that, they would move forward with responsibility to see how the process of de-escalation decided upon on the 6th June meeting would go forward. And obviously the diplomatic channels are operating. I mean, these are perhaps certain areas where the light is being, focused at the moment, and we have to see how that develops.
Can I interrupt? How much hope can we draw from that last paragraph? Because the mantra that the two sides used to express, don't let differences become disputes, has been literally turned on its head by the Chinese. In Pangong, they actually escalated a difference to a dispute. In Galwan, they created a dispute where none existed. So that mantra, which guided the relationship for 20 years, has been literally torn up and thrown out of the window.
Absolutely. It's been destroyed in many ways. And I think in Galwan, not only did the difference become a dispute, the dispute turned into a conflagration. I don't have a D word for it, but certainly it turned into a conflagration. And what are the conclusions that we draw from this? I mean, what are the outcomes for the relationship with China?
Can I put one conclusion to you hesitantly? Doesn't it seem as if China looks at the situation in India and sees this is a country that is suffering a major health crisis, and a lot of the reports suggest that we're not in control of COVID, it could rip through our population. And then China says, this is a country that also has an economic crisis. Its GDP could collapse by something like 12% this year. And China says to itself, clearly India is not just on the back foot, it's as weak as it's been. This is our moment to take advantage of the adverse situation India faces, which is why they've chosen this specific moment to suddenly push us back on the border, extend their territory, and change the LAC. Isn't that a sort of natural conclusion of what China's doing?
Well, that would be, I suppose, an immediate kind of thought that comes to mind as to why the Chinese should have done this. In order to expose our weak spots, as it were. I don't deny that. I mean, the Chinese have always felt uncomfortable with India being defined as a peer, as a country that, is equal to China, has the potential to be the second big power in the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region. So they've been uncomfortable with that thought because they benchmark themselves with the superpower, the United States, or perhaps to some extent with Japan. So they've been uncomfortable with that. They see, you saw the statements that were issued after the revocation of Article 370, particularly the publication of the new maps of the Union Territory of Ladakh and the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, and the kind of vitriolic statements that came out of there. And they're walking a very fine line on the India-Pakistan question also. It's not the same China, which kind of took a rather distanced approach when it came to India-Pakistan issues. Not neutral, perhaps, but at least, kind of the same bromides about how India and Pakistan should solve this, sit down, talk about it. But today, I think it's a very different narrative that's coming out of there. So, in a sense, the whole, all these questions seem to come together to create a new scenario which we have reason to be concerned about.
Absolutely, and that is why I want to ask, how likely is it that the two foreign ministers who began talking yesterday can actually resolve this matter? Yesterday, the statements the both foreign offices issued basically pointed the finger at each other and blamed each other. How likely is it that this process can actually result in China reversing to status quo ante?
In my view, I think that is going to be a long journey. Take Sundaram-Chu, for instance. You know how the two sides faced off from 1986-87 onwards. It took close to 7 years to resolve that problem. And even today, I mean, when nobody is dissecting, again, I'm using that word, as to how that happened, but it took a long 7-year biblical span, as it were, to resolve that, despite the visit of Rajiv Gandhi to China in 1988, which essentially stemmed from the situation which was out.
In fact, you're absolutely right, because the one thing that's apparent this time round, and it's very similar in a sense to Songdong, is that the Chinese have not just occupied substantial bits of Indian territory, they've erected tents. Reports suggest they've brought up heavy vehicles and even artillery. There's even nearby military and air force activity. This is a sign that China intends to stay. Now convincing them to go back to status quo ante will take years, but more than that, it will take India applying pressure itself. Do we have pressure points where we can make the Chinese, to use a colloquialism, squeal?
Well, that's for the government to decide. I think the government has to take a call on whether they are comfortable or they are prepared to allow the situation to escalate further, that you see more pressure points being exerted by India, which obviously will elicit some degree of Chinese reaction, given, the way the Chinese are all roiled up at the moment. So I think we need to, as the saying goes, cross the river feeling the stones. What are the outcomes? How is India best prepared to deal with any eventuality? It's all very well to, you talked about the chest measurements, and I'm not going into that, but we have to go beyond rhetoric on this issue. It's all very well to feed the public rhetoric and to speak to the galleries on this, but our army has to confront the Chinese, and they're well prepared to do that. But we have to take that hard decision, a well-considered, calculated decision. And let me also add that...
Can I interrupt? You're sort of suggesting, although you haven't said it so explicitly, that if we are going to ensure status quo ante, we have to be prepared for conflict. We're going to have to push them back. We may not succeed in negotiating their return. We may have to literally push them back militarily, and that is conflict.
Well, I think the pathway of negotiation should not be abandoned. Obviously, I mean, if you can sort this out through a negotiated interaction with China, it's the best way forward. I think it would redound to the credit of both countries if they're able to do that, especially after the gruesome events of Monday, the 15th of June. But if negotiation fails and, the policy, and I'm saying it can't be determined at the level of the army alone. That's what I wanted to say. You can't say we're leaving it to the army. They will do what is best. National security strategy has to be decided at the highest levels of government under the direction of the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. But you're making it very clear that there's a very good likelihood, I won't put it more strongly than that, that negotiation at a political level may not be sufficient to get the Chinese who've entrenched themselves to now go back. We may have to be prepared for military action. And that means that we cannot rule out the possibility that this could become a conflict.
Well, I think the situation being so volatile, looking at the chemistry at this moment, I think we cannot rule out further tension, further altercation, further confrontation. That we cannot rule out entirely.
Mrs. Rao, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to turn to that second critical question. What impact will this have on India's relationship with China? We'll be back in a moment's time, but first, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is India's former ambassador to China, former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao. Mrs. Rao, right at the very start of this interview, you said what's happened in Galwan is a turning point in India-China relations. I want to pick up on that. To begin with, does this not mean that hereafter it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to trust the Chinese in upholding and implementing all the agreements signed since 1993 to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. That element of trust has now literally been thrown out of the window.
Well, yes, in the U.S.-China context recently, there was a piece that attracted a great deal of attention called "The Death of Engagement" by Orville Schell. Now, would you apply the same term to the India-China situation? Perhaps not. It cannot be the death of engagement with China because, we have this 3,488 kilometer long border with that country. It is our neighbor and next door neighbor. And, you don't get to choose your neighbors, but you have to learn to coexist with them because a regime of conflict and confrontation taken beyond a point is not sustainable, despite the levels of power.
But the trust that was so essential to the tranquility we maintained on the border, surely that trust now is badly damaged. We trusted that they would live up to their commitments. They've now shown they won't.
Yes, I agree that if you take the factor of trust, it is suffering from hypothermia, just like, you see the cold temperatures of Galwan, definitely so, and I'm not saying it in a lighter vein. It will take some time for the relationship to even approximate to some degree of the kind of, interaction that we've had over the last 3.5 decades. So it's not going to happen. It's not going to be business as usual. I think the focus will be essentially on how do we, diffuse.
Can I interrupt and put something else to you? If trust is one commodity that is badly damaged, surely a second is the belief that there was a special rapport or relationship between the two heads of government. Our Prime Minister has met President Xi Jinping 18 times since Mr. Modi came to power in 2014. Apparently, he's visited China 5 times as Prime Minister. And on his last visit as Prime Minister, he actually spoke very eloquently about the bond between the two leaders. Today, it seems as if Xi Jinping simply does not reciprocate that sentiment, and we in India may have been misled by all this talk of the Wuhan spirit.
No, I think all this talk of chemistry and mutual affection between Chinese and Indian leaders, and I'm not just talking of the Xi-Modi equation, I'm looking at the relationship between our top leaders from the time of Chou Enlai and Nehru. I think it's a bit of a chimera to suggest and to assume that there is mutual trust and affection between.
We know that Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai suffered terribly too, but did we make the mistake of falling into another belief that with Modi and Xi Jinping somehow Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was back on track?
I think we Indians tend to be very emotional and rather subjective in our judgments of the Chinese. When the going's good, we are suffused with exhilaration, and when the going is bad, we lapse into deep despondency. But that's the way we are. We tend also to, looking at the public reaction to what has happened, also there's an element of hysteria about
Sure.
China, and you're going to get a lot of that. So what I'm saying is it is a fallacy. I think it is a mistake to assume that all is going well just because you've had a couple of informal summits. And you have to again analyze what kind of leader Xi Jinping is. There he is with that Mona Lisa smile, but really, what goes on behind that countenance? What kind of a leader is he? He's obviously hardline. He has enunciated this China dream, which essentially means making China number one. Does India have any place for it? You recall when Rajiv Gandhi met Deng Xiaoping in Beijing, and Deng said that the Asian century will be incomplete without India and China. Where are the Chinese leaders speaking about it? You may argue that was also a bromide by Deng Xiaoping, and what happened after that. So what I'm saying is, be very realistic, be very hard-nosed, and be very cool-headed when it comes to dealing with China.
Let me then take up a couple of broader foreign policy implications of what's happened in Galwan. To begin with, Do you think this will have an impact on India-China trade? They have a $57 billion surplus. Are we going to see definite moves being made by the Indian government, leave aside the Indian people, to ensure that the trade balance changes and that our dependence on Chinese imports diminishes dramatically?
Well, I'm sure that's the instinctive approach at this moment. We'll have to see what the government decides. This will obviously have to involve consultations with the Commerce Ministry and the trade organizations. Yes, it's bound to cast some shadows on the India-China trade. Already there's so much concern about the adverse balance of trade. And the public mood is that, don't buy Chinese goods, don't buy Chinese things. So, politically it may be opportune at this moment to kind of respond to those calls and impose greater controls. But I don't see, trade absolutely being cut off between the two countries as a result of this.
Absolutely, because there's so much that China produces that we don't, and it makes it so much cheaper than we could, that we would actually be denying our people things that otherwise they cannot get. But let me move to another aspect. This whole problem in Galwan happened at the time.
And if I may add,
your voice is breaking up. I don't know.
add something?
I said your voice is breaking up. Let me put this to you. Everything that's happened at Galwan has sort of coincided with problems that we have with Nepal over the Kala-Pani border, and it's happening at a time when we believe that Chinese are upset with steps that we've taken in Jammu and Kashmir, steps that India has taken vis-a-vis Pakistan. Do you see somewhere the emergence, I won't put it more strongly than that, of a Nepal-China-Pakistan linkage?
Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but I am certainly concerned about the Chinese presence and involvement and investment in Pakistan is beyond any limits that we've seen before. So you see the extent to which Pakistan has been drawn into the Chinese orbit, or the way China has sucked in Pakistan. Is that going to happen with Nepal also? So these are the two countries, I think, that will be of the utmost concern to us when we talk of our neighborhood and we talk of how India's position is, in a sense, being challenged.
Now, China, as you pointed out in part one, is showing similar assertiveness in its relationship with America, with Australia, with Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, where one of the countries that it's been buzzing the fishing fleets of is Japan. Is this a moment when India should reach out to them, or would that be a mistake?
I think we should definitely reach out to them. And I think many of these countries want to see an India that is a little less subtle, if I may put it that way, about how it visualizes its developing relationships with these countries. Obviously our body language would suggest that we would like to draw closer, we would like to align our interests more. I think we'll have to be a little more outspoken on these issues, because I think our friends in the United States and Japan and Australia, for that matter, are looking to see a more vocal and more assertive India. Assertiveness need not just be on the border. It can be assertive in our diplomacy. We want to be a leading power. Let's inject a degree of assertiveness into that also. And I think it does us no harm to align our interests much more closely with these countries and to be a little more vocal about it. I don't think we need to look over our shoulders at how the Chinese would react.
Now, there are three important multilateral groups that we are a part of, where China plays a major role as well. I'm talking about BRICS, I'm talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I'm talking about Russia, India, China. And if I'm not mistaken, there is a Russia, India, China meeting that is scheduled for just a couple of days' time. In the light of what China has done, should we opt out of that, distance ourselves, keep a certain aloofness, or would that be a mistake?
I really don't know if we will be ready to attend the Russia-India-China meeting, as you say, which is upcoming so soon after the Galwan tragedy. So I'm sure that we will be taking a deep breath on that at the moment. But I don't believe we'll abandon the Russia-India-China interaction, because it's not a bad thing for us, and I think we need to pay much more attention to our relations with Russia. Today, Russia has been drawn as literally into the Chinese camp. If you look at the Eurasian landmass, as it were, and the BRI activities of the Chinese, and Russia has kind of stepped back, although it has for years, for generations, for a century and a half, it's been numero uno in Central Asia. But today it has kind of decided to cede space to China. Why? Because it's essentially isolated in the world. You know, the whole Western attitude to Russia. So I think we need to make some calculations and some kind of balancing on that front also. But as far as BRICS is concerned, to what extent it's been effective, and to what extent it's made a difference, I don't really know. India has, I think it has time to weigh its involvement with BRICS as we go forward. As far as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is concerned, I think these events really should make us reconsider the level of our involvement and, to my mind, even our disengagement from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
We're coming to the end of this interview. I'll ask you two quick questions. What's your assessment of the way the Modi government, and I mean both Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaishankar, have handled this crisis? There are sections of the Indian press that believe there should have been more strategic communication from the Modi government. In comparison, China has done a lot of talking, a lot of explaining. We haven't done anywhere near as much. Do you share that criticism, or do you actually think that a measure of silence is perhaps wise?
Well, strategic communication can also include restraint, can include deliberation, can avoid attempts to whip up hysteria and sentiments. But to what degree was that strategic communication evident, in place, in the lead up to Galwan? That's the question. And I think the government could have done much better on that front.
In other words, we could be dignifying the government's silence by claiming that there was a certain strategy behind it. That's very beautifully put.
No, I'm not saying that. I don't think there was a strategy behind it. I think the government was not communicative enough. And I think the government spokesman should have been able to guide the narrative on this and to introduce a degree of sobriety into, the debate in the public space. I don't believe that was done sufficiently.
My last question, many people say that since 1962, India has developed a complex about China. That shadow continues to overhang not just the country, but our politicians, perhaps even our diplomats. And so when there's a problem, we become cautious, we become defensive. Is 1962 a shadow that we have failed to push aside?
I think there's a great degree of atavism when it comes to our dealings with China. I think the images of 1962, the memories of that conflict are embedded in the psychology of India, of Indians, and our opinion makers, our politicians, our media. So that's the way the cookie crumbles at the moment, and we have to understand that. It's a very complex attitude that we possess to China, and also to some extent it's not very well informed. To what extent have our cognoscenti, as it were, studied the history of this dispute and understood the steps and missteps we made and we took in the run-up to that conflict, and how do we understand Chinese behavior better? You talk of the events in Galwan. I mean, there's so many parables in that lead up to 1962 that we need to ingest as a country, and that hasn't happened, Karan.
That's very beautifully put. We've given ourselves a complex without actually understanding the situation, without actually understanding what happened and what lay behind 1962. Perhaps we need to, at this point, come to terms with our history better if we're going to be in control of our future. Mrs. Rao, thank you very much for this interview. Take care and stay safe.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.